And also really excited for this evening. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And I'm also really happy so many people were interested in the topic of tonight. Jeremy, how long do we know each other? I think 8 years, 9 years.
Something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a friendship that has been, I think really Aurobindo and Rudolf Steiner brought us together first. That was our mutual interest. And then Gebser came third. And then the Gebser thing between us got more and more intense. We share a couple of things. Or what I'm particularly loving about you is also the share for eco-psychology, the Anthropocene culture, films, science fiction. So you're a person who fascinates me since many years, and I've been very happy we could contribute your work in the Integral Forum. We presented your book, Seeing Through the World, when it came out, and your articles. Sometimes we translated them. And I think some met you also at the IEC 2 years ago in Budapest, or out of Budapest, where you've been a speaker. You were also a keynote speaker for the Integral Conference last year, which we had to postpone due to Corona and troubles. So we're more than happy to have you here tonight. And I think the first part of the evening will be more getting to know you and hearing your on-abouts on the topic we've opened for tonight, and then we will go in dialogue with everyone. I just want to repeat quickly for everyone who's coming in later that we're going to record this. Also wir werden dieses Happening aufnehmen, und wer nicht mit Gesicht aufgenommen werden möchte, kann im Prinzip sich muten oder stumm schalten. Und alle Fragen während des Abends bitte in den Chat schreiben, und ich versuche das dann so zu moderieren, dass wir die Fragen, die ihr habt, ich sie an Jeremy übersetze und an ihn herantrage und ihr dann in Dialog gehen könnt, sodass wir nicht alle gleichzeitig sprechen, was ein bisschen schwierig wäre. Genau. Jeremy, when we talked about tonight, and then you were thinking about it this morning, and I thought about it today, something came to my heart the most, and this was the thing about intensity. How Gebser again and again repeats that radical intensity is something that comes with the shift from mental to integral, which is not yet to have happened, as Gebser, in difference to Wilber, has been a little bit more reluctant to say we are already integral. It's more as something to come. But then again, we have the tricky thing about past and present and future. So the question is the future already in us, inherent, of course? And I thought I just want to start this evening with a quote from Gebser, and then ask you, Jeremy, opening this evening, how you feel personally about this quote. And it's maybe something also we can talk about in the second part of the evening. So I hope I don't get anyone annoyed now that I'm reading something from Gebser in English, but so that Jeremy knows what we're talking about. This is what we'll do. Okay, so he's saying, Gebser saying, what does all of this have to do with daily life? Something decisive, since what is emerging in the greater context must be concurrently co-prepared in the lesser. This does not mean that it is the number of those who realize and live the new that is decisive. Decisive is the intensity with which the individuals live the new.
One of my favorite lines. And I wouldn't worry too much about translation, Aurobindo wrote all of his works in English, right? And Gebser obviously had a strong transmission from Aurobindo. So there's something that's hopefully reaching across the language barriers between Aurobindo, Gebser, Teilhard, and with our own readings today. But thank you, Cordula, and thank you, Christoph, and the Integral Forum in Germany. It's an honor to be here. It's really exciting to see so many new faces and new individuals who maybe have been interested in Gebser for a long time or discovering Gebser for the first time. So that's sort of the question that we were talking about yesterday: intensification. And in some ways, that quote is very appropriate, decisive, right? Is the intensity in which we live this new consciousness, and not so much the quantity of people who do. I think that's absolutely right in the sense that the power to impart with integral consciousness is more important than necessarily the numbers or the quantitative measurement, right? This is an intensification and a qualitative intensification of our consciousness. The effect that has, I think, is in multitude. It is somewhat difficult to measure. And I think that needs to be priority. It's really kind of shifting our sense of priorities, moving away from the quantitative and towards the qualitative again. So I love that quote. I always share it with my students. So I'm very happy you opened with that.
So the intensity, we're talking also about mutations and leaps of consciousness in the language of Gebser. And maybe we can also start this evening, when we talk about intensity, also talking about what is the declination, or what comes with, in your experience, the sense of mutation which we're in currently.
I think we're experiencing mutation in a way that we don't need to read a book to actually understand, especially this past year in 2020. The feeling in which history was sort of condensing to, as they say, the head of a needle, right? That everyday events were happening with a capital E, that the ground underneath us was dramatically shifting and maybe no longer a ground that we can rely on. And I'm not just talking about measurable systems or global supply trades or any of the kind of measurable material aspect of that, but a deep felt sense that the world that we had been inhabiting, the times in which we were employing, the 9 to 5, the busyness, the going out, all of this kind of forward rushing is somehow incompatible with the future. That kind of future is running out, right? And that we don't really know how to adjust ourselves, and we don't really know what we are becoming. So dramatic periods of mutation are just that. They're very dramatic. They're this feeling of the ground underneath your feet just slipping away. And there's a stretching and a pulling and a condensing of our sense of time and self. And I think a lot of us have felt that this past year. So one of the things I brought up to my students was, we were reading Ever Present Origin, and I kept saying, just look out the window, just look at yourself. The best teacher right now is the world in its current process and state. This is what mutation is. So in some ways it couldn't have been a better year to teach a Gebser course. And I think this year as well, to kind of go into some of the offerings that we're going to be exploring, and then what I'm doing in the States is, there's so many examples we can draw from constantly, and so many opportunities to examine our sense of time and self, which right now seems to be profoundly shifting. We can go into that too, but I'll just mention one of the things at the outset of the pandemic. When the lockdown was just beginning, a lot of my students and I, we were exploring this sense of halting, this sense of abruptness, this sense of being stopped, and feeling that tension between the momentum of wanting to continue forward and being forced to shelter in place, or being forced to have our lifestyles disrupted and our work disrupted. And then this sense of things picking up again, but there's almost a distrust now, and like, can we really just pick things up again? There's a kind of displacement from our sense of time that is really important, I think, critical to what's going on right now as part of this mutation. So I'll just pause here if you want to interject, Cordula.
Yeah, so no, that's great. So it's a kind of a crisis, right? It's a kind of a not knowing. It's a kind of complete reorganization. And also, yeah, a kind of a discomfort. Is that correct?
Very much so. A deep, more so than a simple existential worry about resources, or right now in Texas in the United States, people are searching for water and toilet paper and heat, but there's this deeper level or a deeper strata in that, I think, which is the way in which we have been running this culture is no longer working. So there's this loss of faith, I think, in the way we've been employing our culture. And then obviously what we're interested in is how that works with the structures of consciousness, right? And what is the world that our structure of consciousness has imparted and employed and in which we live in. When that begins to break down, it's a real deep sense of vertigo, of not having a sense of where we can stand. But this is why I think having an integral orientation is helpful, in that we at least know to where we can begin to look, to our sense of time, to our sense of self, to what we call in a lot of the integral circles right now, the way in which we are sense making the world. These things can really help reorient us. And I think, like Gebser was writing about, over half a century ago, 75 years ago, that there are criteria for this new consciousness. There are qualities that are emergent and that are latent and that we can pick up on, as a cultural phenomenologist, as individual practitioners who choose to wrestle with that capacity to live the new, as Gebser is talking about. That is, it's in the lesser as it is in the greater. And maybe in the lesser, in the individual, that looks like the capacity for plasticity and flexibility, the capacity to get over ourselves, some degree of ego freedom and pliability that is required of us right now to make it through this crisis. Maybe it also is inviting us into a kind of reckoning, a kind of remediation, right? Being forced to accommodate a new sense of time right now, being asked to stop, or being asked to go inward, or being asked to kind of do this dance of quarantine lockdown and then coming back out and then going back in. There's a kind of potential rhythmicity in that, like as Gebser talks about, a different form of time that we might employ. So right now, I think, is a wonderful opportunity to explore how these structures of consciousness are directly applicable to our daily lives and our daily living. And that's actually one of my favorite sections of Ever-Present Origin. Towards the end of the book, the little subsection on daily living. I would love for that to be its own little publication, to be able to share with somebody, like, how do you live an integral life? What does an integral life practice actually look like? And I always recommend that section to my students and peers. So
this is great. We also got a question coming in, but I just quickly want to add to what you say. Daily integral praxis. So how do you think Gebser would have understood a daily integral practice? How would his day have looked like?
I think Gebser's an interesting example, because he didn't really take up, like today, we're in such a different world, right? So many Eastern practices and traditions, contemplative practices that are also available to us, yoga, zazen, everything is now available to us. And Gebser wasn't really, just due to his personality and what he was drawn to, I don't think he really did anything like that, right? So his daily practice was, I kind of consider him as a sort of natural organic mystic, in that brilliant intellectual, deeply poetic and sensitive in a sort of creative, aesthetic way. I think poetry for him was a way of accessing these different states. I think he was prone to them, and his path, in a way, his yoga was poetry and deep study. I think it opened up these realities and intensities for him. So I don't know if his path was necessarily everyone's path, but the subtext, I think, in his writing is cultivating through whatever means a capacity to become more present. Always, there's a sort of contemplative injunction in it, right? That to be present, that origin is in the present, that the structures must be concretized through the senses, not necessarily abstractly. Not even the mental can be concretized abstractly. The mental is a very embodied thing, right? I mean, he spent so much time talking about the eye and perspective and material body and standing in place. There's such a sense of embodiment in that, the direction of the will, that it's all an embodied practice. It's all a kind of becoming present. So I think as more contemporary individuals, we have a lot of opportunities to look for different contemplative practices that can enable us to just cultivate presence in day-to-day life. But the other aspect that is maybe a bit more active is the kind of noticing Gebser points out throughout his writing about, okay, well, you really have to pay attention to how magical time is employed in day-to-day life, how it does arise for you. There's some beautiful passages, again, in the daily life section about, the rhythmicity of the heartbeat, is the mythic, right? It is our participation in the cosmos. The mental directness, our ability to attend to that kind of clock time, is our capacity to employ that mental structure. Magic as well. And then the deep dreamless sleep of the archaic, that we always participate in daily life. We move through these structures. So the integral practitioner, I think, is somebody who is cultivating an awareness of that, an awareness of how we are fluidly and dynamically always moving in this very interrelated and complex way between all of these structures. And it doesn't have to be an intellectual exercise. I think it is very much just a noticing exercise, a sensory exercise. And then eventually, I mean, there's no systematic practice that he offers, but we get the sense, or at least I get the sense, that when we do this enough, when we pay attention to magical attunement in the gut and in the ear, mythical heart, and the mythical image, when we pay attention to the mental wakefulness and see the fluidity of these structures, in enough time, we gain a kind of fluidity as a whole, right? We gain a sense of this emergent whole in the present. So there's many, I think, creative ways in which individuals can do that. And that's why I also really enjoy Sri Aurobindo talking about integral yoga as being something hyper individuated. And it really is up to each person how that is actualized. But there are criteria like this, like, can we concretize the structures? Can we be fluid and dynamically move between them all in the present, and enable that intensity to come alive of itself in us, right? It's not something we're actively making happen per se, but it is also happening to us. So it's a way, it's an art rather than a systematic process.
That's wonderful. I love that feeling you awake here of fluidity. And I like to add, I love also how he uses the description of nature, the description of moods in the sky or phenomena in nature as something, yes, maybe also a practice that was giving him big moments of awakenings, right? Maybe
Very
you
much so.
want to say something. I don't know if everyone knows about this. Maybe you'd like to just quickly say a few words about him and Rilke and the sky of Spain.
Yeah. Aaron Cheek has a great biographical essay where he translated a lot of this into English. And so Gebser, for those of us who are not familiar with Gebser biographically, I mentioned he was a poet, and very much I think his muse was Rilke, especially in his early years, and he was something of a uh, um, he was a wanderer. He wanted to follow in the footsteps of Rilke and the Bohemians and the new artistic movements in Europe, and he sort of followed as a sort of a poetic pilgrimage to Malaga in Spain. And in 1932, I think 1931, 1932 winter, in that cusp, he had this series of kind of realizations. One particular one, he calls it a lightning-like flash of insight. And this lightning-like flash of insight would require the next 20 years to unpack and to write and to explore in all of his books. But yes, there's a hauntingly beautiful passage from his journal, I believe, talking about the vibrating emptiness of the sky over Spain and the ancientness of the city, the presence of the dead in the city. It may sound silly, but I had an encounter with that when I first visited Europe. When I went to Hungary for the Integral European Conference. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I'll say it to make this point. That was the first time I visited Europe, and the layers, the presence of history in a place that has so many layers, it is palpable in more ancient spaces. And I could really feel that. I could get the sense of the presence of the dead in a place that was so old and so inhabited by human beings for so long, that the stones were still standing in certain places. So yes, he felt this sense of a deep and living past, an openness of the Malaga sky, and then this lightning-like flash of inspiration where I think all of ever-present origin sort of flashed, right? The wholeness of time, the openness of the world. We call the openness of the open world in the English translation. That was present for him. And, I think for many more decades, he really had to try to unpack, what is this? How do we understand this? And why do I sense this through Rilke, that openness? He talked about Rilke kind of solving the problem of death for the individual to overcome that sort of mystic's abyss of the dark night and to reach some kind of integral orientation in living, kind of integrality with death. So Gebser, yeah, he was quite a poet, and I have to recommend both reading that essay by Cheek with the translations, or if you have access to the collected works yourself, or moving over to another translation which he wrote much later, the Winter Poem in 1944, I believe, which Rudolf Hammerli. I'm not sure if Rudolf is here, but he describes it as the poetic expression of ever-present origin distilled into poetry. And Gebser is quite a profound poet. So if you're interested, and I mentioned this in my writing too, he's a catalytic writer, and that reading ever-present origin and reading Gebser really works on you in a way that is psychoactive, that is intensifying, or it can at least. A lot of my students describe it that way, and I certainly feel that way. But more so his poetry is just deeply transmissive. So yeah, does that hopefully that, I mean, some of us may already be familiar with his biographical notes, but he was sort of prone to these experiences. That 1944 poem, which happened, I think he mentions writing it in like 45 minutes, Malaga, Spain, and then later in his life in Sarnath, India, where he has what D.T. Suzuki described for him in a letter as a Satori experience. Again, a beautiful writing describing this sort of openness which is somehow achieved in him or realized in him. And he describes it as not eradicable, but something that stayed with him ever since his experience in Sarnath for the rest of his life. So like I said, he was prone to these states of consciousness, these forms of realization, and he did so with his poetic and intellectual sensibility. So thank you for bringing that up, and I hope folks actually check out those poems because they're quite beautiful.
We actually got the part you mentioned from Aaron translated in the media section from the Integral Forum. So we got a very nice translation. Tom and Mark made that one. So if anyone wants to read more about this, you can find that there. We will add some links in the end. We have a question here from Karin Kettling. So we've gone a little bit further to where the question was, but maybe Karin, would you like to ask the question yourself right this moment, or has it maybe answered a little bit already? Does Karin, is she here?
Yeah.
Can she?
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, you said something about criteria. It's long ago that you mentioned this. Yeah, now there were other items, but well, I struggle sometimes with this describing consciousness. If people tell me, yes, there were centuries ago, there was a society which was at a much higher level, or no, we have an evolutional influence, it's getting better and better. I cannot measure, or measure is the wrong word, but I have no criteria for the increasing, what you described, this consciousness to deal integral, to get in flow with all what happens. Can you give me help to understand?
Yeah. No, I think this is one of the key discussions Gebser introduces in Ever-Present Origin, which is a view of the structures of consciousness that is not strictly developmental or stage-oriented, but rather that these structures are core expressions of our being. They are interrelated aspects of the whole of human consciousness as a whole, whether we're talking about magical timelessness and participation, or mythical image making with the psyche, or mental directness and alertness and quantitative thinking, right? The cutting, discerning thought. These are all capacities of the human being. And to the degree that we can talk about a historical process, it's in which these particular structures kind of flower in history and come to some kind of predominant phase where they are sort of the overreaching, what is a good way to talk about it, an attractor, or a kind of a logic of the age, right, that really draws individuals to realize it in some capacity. And then it moves into a deficient phase where historically it collapses. Historically, that consciousness structure collapses back into latency. It goes through some kind of crisis, and a new one leaps forward. So Gebser's view of the history of consciousness is one of a series of discontinuous leaps or mutations, in which there is some form of emergence, but I don't think Gebser would say that these forms of emergence are in any kind of linear sense higher or better, right? The mythical structure and its image-making capacity has its own kind of a genius, to borrow a mental word, not really appropriate, but image making and learning the language of myth is different from learning the language of logic and the mental world and the spatial secular world. It's using a different, I mean, even a different theorists like Julian Jaynes talks about the left and right hemisphere, and Ian McGilchrist also talks about kind of the right-brained earlier structure, earlier consciousness, and the modern left-brained. I think these are different ways of talking about different emphases that have come online and are mastering or operating in the world, and then go into some kind of crisis. For the integral, though, it's really the only time I think we can talk about a maturation, in the sense that for Gebser's integral, the mental is going through its own breakdown process. The mental perspectival world is in a crisis, and what is required is the whole. So it's not so much, what's the next step? It's the whole needs to be remediated. The magical intelligence, mythical intelligence, mental intelligence, all of these things have to come online. So there's a kind of a transparency in that consciousness structure of the integral structure that he's talking about, where both the more nighttime oriented dreaming psyche and the genius of that structure, of those structures of the unperspectival world, and the genius of the waking mental structure both come together. And that's the tricky thing. Actually, throughout Ever-Present Origin, he's always saying, let's not talk about progress, because we easily slip into a I mean, what would we say today? This is colonial, this is Eurocentric, but Gebser had his own language. He said the mental structure has a kind of privilege. It sees itself as the locus and arbiter of what's real, and it wants to dismiss the magic and the mythic. But those are valid and even co-valid realities within us. They're co-valid structures of consciousness. So one of the interesting things is, I was bringing it back to practice for the individual. He always has these interesting remarks in his writing where he's talking about, look, I know what you're going to say. You're going to talk about how magic isn't real and you're going to have your doubts, but just suspend that as we go through this and learn about this structure, about the magic, for instance, or about the mythic and its own language, its own knowledge. Just suspend your disbelief. And I think that's partly the key to what he's talking about, to resuscitate or remediate these older structures and bring them out of latency, out of a kind of severing that the mental structure has done, and restore them into the whole. And so that requires a different relationship with the past that isn't as backwards looking. In some ways, remediating the past is what the future, part of what the future is about, right? So long way of saying that in terms of different societies and their evolution, I think Gebser would say, and a lot of other theorists that I very much enjoy, like David Wengrow and David Graeber, that human beings are this dynamically complex, interrelated whole. There's different expressions of consciousness, and the ancient societies are not lesser developed than the modern societies. We have the mental expression that may be very well developed, even overdeveloped, overemphasized. So the key is to deflate that and get a more intensified sense of the whole. Like, that's our challenge right now. That's our crisis. It's a defixate from this mental progression. And that requires a new sense of time, and I think a new sense of relationship with the past. But I hope that answers, or at least kind of gets into it a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Let me just add there another word, another keyword: diaphany, durchscheinen, nocturnal, receptive. You know, you opened the trace, you opened that alley now. So let's talk a little bit. Why is for Gebser the nocturnal, the receptive, the passive, and the diaphanic moment so valuated? And let me just add questions. Anyone who has questions, just write in the chat, and then we can bring them in.
Great. Yes. Yes, feel free to jump in if you have a question, or raise your hand, or let us know in the chat. Okay. So,
Jeremy, sorry, could you check the waiting room, for instance?
Oh, sure. Let's see. Are you co-host, Christoph? Let me see. Make
Am
co-host.
I co-host? Right. I'm
there. You go.
now. Okay, thank you. I'll check if there are other people who want to get in.
Great. Thank you. So please, by all means, questions, reflections. I would love to hear your perspectives. But nocturne and passivity. Okay, so there's some really interesting layers here, right? That Gebser sees. The broad brush, we could say, for succinctness, is that the earlier structures of consciousness, the presence of the dead that Gebser talks about as this palpable reality that he senses through the poetry of Rilke. And he writes that book Lorca and the Realm of the Mothers, that he publishes in the 1940s about his friend. The presence of the feminine, the presence of an active relationship with the underworld, the world of the dead and the living being entwined with one another. They go hand in hand as well with, I think, a different relationship with the natural world, the human and the non-human becoming one another, especially in the magical consciousness, where there's an interweaving of human, non-human, inside, outside, magical practice, right? That one point is all points. That interchangeability is much more present in the older structures, the earlier structures of the magic, archaic, and the mythic. The mental is more associated for Gebser as a coming to wakeful consciousness. But just as we would say our dreaming life and our or maybe we wouldn't say this as moderns, right? But for Gebser, the dreaming life, the night time, or the sidereal and the nocturne are equally important expressions of consciousness as the waking. But just as when we wake up and forget our dreams, we deprioritize these earlier structures as if they were just an evaporating dream, right? A fantasy that has faded away, and we're now awake and more mature and more adult, and we no longer do those things or practice magic, etc. Gebser's saying, no, those will always remain a part of us. They will always be co-constituents of reality, of the human being. And if we don't have a healthy relationship with those things, those expressions of consciousness, they will, to one degree or another, come back with a vengeance in a very deficient form. And he even goes so far as to describe, that the waking ego becomes a plaything of these deeper powers. Jung is really good talking about this. Steiner is really good talking about this. And I particularly enjoy the American depth psychologist James Hillman discussing the kind of plurality of the psyche and its reality in contemporary culture. So these things are always at play, and without a capacity to really engage with them with equanimity, this is the kind of difficult thing I think Gebser talks about too, is when we are reintegrating these structures, reintegrating the history of consciousness, it's very easy and even alluring to allow those structures to resurge and overtake us and to become dominated by them and diminish the waking consciousness again. But we don't really want to do that. That's not the integral either, right? It's not to just go back into magic and mythic and diminish the mental. For Gebser, it's this sense of well, I use this as a practice word for my students as well. I borrow from meditation practice, but equanimity, I think, is really important. And he doesn't use it that way. He says detached or dispassionate. In the English translation, he has a few different words for this. But it's this capacity to really approach this just being present to it, not judging these earlier structures and their intensities, not judging them and trying to make sense of the reality of the psyche, but allowing it to express itself on its own terms without being overcome or submerged by it. And the same thing goes then for the waking mental structure, to really become aware of how we are participating in making the mental world, in enacting it, and not succumb to an overemphasis on it, or a sort of I don't really know what the word would be, but there is a kind of submerging that can happen in too much of the spatial orientation, where we begin to feel that this is the only thing that is real, right, in terms of the secular spatial world. So he's really kind of saying there's almost a way to see through all of this. As you mentioned, diaphany, this principle of diaphany for Gebser is this capacity to render the world transparent, the nighttime world of the magic and the mythic, and then the waking world of the mental structure, which he does associate more with patriarchy, right? And the earlier structure is more matriarchal. Is seeing through both. Is this capacity. In the English translation is a beautiful phrase for it. Diaphany is the epiphany of the spiritual, an epiphany of the spiritual, right? A crystallization or realization of this originary spiritual presence, is to see through both. So that's the difficult thing that my students, and myself, I wrestle with, to be in the world, not privileging the waking egoic consciousness and not dismissing the earlier magical and mythical intensities, to allow both to become co-present in us, to hold that in an intensity of presence. I think that's one of the great challenges for the integral structure for us as individuals exploring a practice. And we could move, I won't mention it right now, but I think that is a reflection of the whole that we're dealing with right now, just in terms of the arc of modernity, the whole process of what's going on right now in our civilization, and the way in which it's being composted, in a sense, there's a decomposition and composting of this overemphasized mental world. And if we can relate to this better as individuals, I think, perhaps as a whole, we could deal with these crises better as well. But there's more to it than that. But yeah, sorry, I went off on a tangent there.
Oh, that was great. I think in a minute we can really open up for sharing and discussing things. So just one last question maybe. So to have a kind of a big part of stuff now we could discuss. Anthropocene, bringing that in. So, sense of identity, sense of fluidity, sense of, we talked about day and night and past and future and magic and mental. Now, why is for you personally, Jeremy, the topic of the Anthropocene so interesting?
Oh yes, it's been it's been factored. I've been factoring into my new book that I'm working on right now, called Fragments of an Integral Futurism. But I talk about it in the Gebser book as well a little bit. So I even prefer Donna Haraway's Cthulhu scene over Anthropocene, but Anthropocene is recognized in scientific literature and discourse, and it basically means the era of anthropogenic climate change, human influenced climate change. But there's so many implications with that in terms of the relationship between nature and culture, between civilization and the biosphere, between the human being and the non-human. All of those questions begin to be explored. It's like, as Gebser talks about too, right? With transparency and diaphany, transparency is one of the themes of this integral consciousness. Transparency, particularly of time, of the deep past that is still alive and latent, and also the future that is alive and latent in us, and shaping us as we shape it. So there's this dynamic interrelationship he talks about that's achieved through transparency. And I think the Anthropocene is a great example of this sort of dynamic interrelationship and transparency between the human and the non-human world. And a lot of philosophers have played around with the idea, like Timothy Morton from Rice University writing about hyperobjects, how we're entangled in these brilliantly complex processes of our individual lives, driving our cars, using our energy, in these sort of macro structures that are changing the climate. So when strange weather hits, like it is right now in the United States, there's a sense in which, and this isn't true for everyone thinking about it or consciously thinking about it, but for a lot of these philosophers talking about the Anthropocene, there's a sense in which the storms that hit us are a part of us, that they're a part of what human beings have made. When strange hurricanes come earlier in the season in Florida, where I live, or stronger ones, there's the sense in which I'm entangled in these processes. And it's that sort of entanglement, and it's that sort of transparency between the human and the non-human that I find to be fascinating. And if Gebser was writing perhaps about contemporary development in the humanities of integral themes, I think he would write down, the post-human turn that a lot of academics are talking about, or the Anthropocene, about the transparency between the human and the non-human. But one of the most important aspects of particularly the climate crisis, which is a clear indication of what he described as time eruption, the eruption of time, is the way in which, particularly for the sensitive scholars who are talking about this, the realization that what is going on right now is a kind of heated intensity of the past, the burning of coal and fossil fuel, etc., from the 1700s, 1800s, past few centuries. They're erupting into the present, right? And even that, there's another layer of the billions of years of life during the I believe it is a Carboniferous period, where we get a lot of our coal from, right? So there's this deep time aspect to all the fuel that we're burning, and also a historical aspect of our ancestors who burned this fuel and went mining and burned coal in, let's say, 1842, right? Is intimately involved in the heating that we feel or the odd weather that we feel today. And everything we're doing right now is intimately involved in the kind of future we're going to leave for the coming generations who are already latent. So there's this sense in which time has intensified. There's a beautiful line from a book on the climate crisis called In the Progress of This Storm. And I think he borrows a little bit from Walter Benjamin talking about time and the angel of history for that title. But he also talks about Benjamin and temps. The meaning of temps in French is both, obviously temperature, but also weather. It means weather. Is it hot or is it cold? What are the rhythms of time? So it's actually hearkening to a mythical time. But he's talking about, in the context of the climate crisis, the way in which we have become wrapped up, and he says the whole of time, HOLE, that it's almost like a singularity we're collapsing into of past, present, and future, as fossil fuels from the past few generations are burned up in the present storms, and as we ourselves are consuming the future by continuing to burn fossil fuels and creating this crisis. So there's a temporal element that is exploding in the Anthropocene that is, again, I don't think it's necessarily a healthy expression. This is not integral time freedom in the efficient, but it is an intensification of time in a way that more of us can feel more than ever before. So that's a little taste of the Anthropocene discourse, but we could do a whole talk about that one.
Well, there's this beautiful saying to that, the present as the poetics of the future. It's a saying of his, the present as the poetics of the future. What does he mean? Why does he say poetics? What do you think?
Oh, that's so good. I don't know. I know Gebser talks about that origin is creativity, that where creativity is happening, there is the spiritual presence of origin. I think poesis, making, creating, he's saying there is an originary intensity in any act of making, creation, right? So I think that having that attitude, that time, there's a sort of poesis of time in the present. It's so beautiful, right? That in creative works, we're dealing with not one or two or three, but we're also dealing with the fourth dimension. We're dealing with time as a whole and the intensity of making something, in the creative act of making something, that the future is involved in it as well as the past. So I think this is an orientation that, again, I'm mentioning the Anthropocene, that's the flip side of that intensity as a crisis is this beautiful kind of, as you mentioned, a poesis of making with time, of making with the future and the past in the present. And I think this is sort of the a latent expression of what the human being could be, the homo integer, as he talks about in Ever Present Origin as well. The integral human is one who is making with origin in the present. So I think, we should definitely lean into that. And like I said, right now, there are so many opportunities for anyone to investigate their relationship with time in the present, as both individuals and then as a culture. And there's an efficiency here. I think there is a latent efficiency that we're not quite at yet, right, as a civilization, because there's so much that that we didn't even realize needs to be composted, needs to break down still, in order to kind of cohere and clarify what is emerging. But if we have this orientation, I think at least as individuals, as Gebser says, we can live tomorrow and not be as swung in vertigo, perhaps. Perhaps. I have good days and bad days, though.
Thank you for that answer. So I think now this seems also attentive and quiet. If you like to ask questions, you could just unmute yourself and go ahead. I think we can try it this way, or if you like, just write briefly that you have a question and then we can unmute and get in dialogue. Of course, there's the topic we thought we might talk about is the relationship of Ken Wilber's understanding of integral and Gebser. But at that point, I would leave it to you, to the people attending here, if you're interested in exploring this, or rather go further with the topics we have now kind of touched briefly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, if anyone has questions about, I really appreciated the earlier question about development in societies. If you're new to Gebser, want to know where to get started, Wilbur questions, of course, a lot of interesting avenues to go down. I'd be happy to go down any rabbit hole. Yeah, I see there's a few people thinking. Let's see, Daniela, there we go.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, it's not yet a Wilbur question, Jeremy, but hearing you talk about future and past and time, as I'm not through all Gebser's work yet, what is about time and field energy, or time and space? What you could you tell me or tell us about Gebser's thinking or understanding of this this difference or this sameness, whatever it is?
Good question. Yeah, so I think with Gebser, as he articulates space, when we think of space, we think of three-dimensionality, we think of depth perspective, the measurable material world, and the processes that are always going on. We might have images of the Newtonian universe, or even, something much more complex, like systems theory and complex systems, but it's material oriented. One of the things that is very interesting that Gebser brings up is that, this really Renaissance era leaning into perspective, right? Developing perspectival consciousness is the ability to sectorize reality and to lean into the perception of the eye, the senses, vision, right? As our emphasis. Interestingly, Marshall McLuhan makes the same point about what he calls print culture, that it is the eye that becomes this dominant organ of perception. And I think for Gebser, it's the same thing with the mental. Visual perception, the vanishing point, and sectoring reality, really kind of making the cut to measure a piece of the whole abstractly, is really the kind of emphasis that our culture has been running on and working with for a long time. Part of the problem with that, or the switch that starts to occur in the integral, is what he calls the supersession of space. Gebser calls it that. This basically the world in which we have been orienting around, perspectival space, material facts. We're even dealing with this right now in the crisis of fake news or post-truth. Having this sense of losing the measurable ground of reality, right? A shared objective material space. That culturally is breaking down right now. But part of the breakdown is also this eruption of, Gebser called it time, right? The eruption of time and integral consciousness, that the integral structure wouldn't be emphasizing measurable categorical space and distance, three-dimensionality, but four-dimensional interrelationships, processes, things that are qualitative and intensive rather than quantitative and extensive. That's the language, at least the English translation uses. And it's a very complex concept of systasis that I don't want to get into exactly. But what that has to do with is really understanding process and time, having its own kind of logic, its own kind of nature and characteristics that aren't reducible to the categorical and spatial world. And part of this has to do with, as like a experience that we've all gone through. McLuhan is really good at talking about that in witnessing how particularly electronic technology, collapses space. It collapses distance. It entangles us in each other. I mean, we're doing it right now through Zoom, right? Radio had helped to achieve that to some extent. The telegram had helped to achieve that. So there's this collapse of space, and there's a collapse of measurable perspectival space as our static ground that Gebser is talking about as part of this intensity. And to give you visual representations, he talks a lot about the surrealists and the early 20th century artists with avant-garde and sort of the modernists who are all exploring this in one way or another. But I always use the Italian futurists as a good example. Their images, I mean, it's so interesting. They coincide also with the rise of 20th century states and fascism and progress and like all those things. Really interesting to study them. But if you look at their images, space is blowing up, it's erupting. There's things that are just movement everywhere. There's a celebration of the machine and technological spatial movement. I think that's a great expression of this perspectival world. But one of the interesting things Gebser talks about, right, in this theme of intensification is when a structure of consciousness is breaking down, time becomes intensified, but it doesn't make space go away. It ramps up space. So space begins to explode and break apart and go too fast and run away from our control. And I think more than ever, we actually feel this right now, especially with our current civilization, our economic system, the failure of leadership to steer things in a more regenerative direction for the climate. We feel like we've got all of this forward momentum that's still rushing ahead and nobody is able to stop it, or nobody feels empowered enough to be able to stop it. So that's sort of the relationship that is moving into time and space. The explosion and breakdown and collapse of space is this sort of vertigo of the 20th century. And now very much so, the internet and post-truth and a lot of the crises we've seen today are just like, it's just ramping up what Gebser was talking about, 75 years ago, in terms of now everybody has their own mini version of perspectival space. You can go on the internet and completely have your own reality and other people and insulate yourself against others. There's hyper fragmentation. That sectoring of the Renaissance has now become weaponized or become toxic, right? And so I talk a little bit about that in my book, that the perspectival sectoring of the world has now kind of run amok. And I'll leave you one more parallel Gebser remarks that I find to be very interesting. He talks about a lot of the eruption of space when it was efficient in the ancient world as a way in which we got a stable ground over the mythical structure. And there's all of these myths about demons and floods and things threatening to overwhelm and submerge us. And it's really this kind of wakeful consciousness that was able to stand above it. And he gives Christianity as an example, as this mental expression of the logos that stands above the intensity of the water, right? Of the mythical ocean, of Oceanus. So this kind of myth of like, when a structure of consciousness goes into a deficient mode, it actually looks more powerful than ever. It's overwhelming. It's a flood. It's more of the thing it was good at, but now it's too much, So that kind of running away in intensity is a good indication of that transformation. And we see that today with this tension between the spatial perspectival world and this new and emergent aperspectival world of time and intensity. Yeah, I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great question. And that's one of the things we'll be talking about in the course. Cordula, we could talk about that as well at some point, but and share some links for everybody. But we will be hosting a online course with Integral Germany. I think we'll be hosting 6 or 7 lectures, and it'll be basically seminar format where we can really deep dive into reading ever-present origin and talking about integral phenomenology and everything else. So really looking forward to that, and they'll share the links for you in the chat. Yeah, there we go.
That's right. Thank you, Christoph. Yeah, I think we're starting on the 12th of March, if I got it right. And maybe it will be just a more in-depth learning and studying also offer. And I'm really looking forward to that. And in that smaller format, I will be also translating much more. So if anyone is inhibited by language, we will try to make it a little bit slower and a little bit more intimate, so the German and English can go parallel most of the time. Yeah. Okay, but I'll mute myself again, and if there's any more questions from...
Yeah, it doesn't have to be about what I just talked about. It could be anything. So
yeah, maybe I can ask something. So hi. So thank you. It was really interesting for me because I'm really new to this topic. Yeah, I got around Ken Wilber in the summer, and it made a lot of sense for me. So I understood a lot of things that I couldn't explain before when I read his books, and so I'm really interested in it and want to know a lot more. And for me, it's what I always also wonder is, what can I do, or me as a person and we as a society, to deal with everything maybe Gebser knows or Ken Wilber, to how can we integrate it in our daily life?
Yeah, beautiful question. Speaks a little bit to what Cordula was saying or asking earlier about integral consciousness in daily life. You know, in many ways, what Gebser talked about with his own expression of what it means to be integral in day-to-day living is, it's so simple. It's so radically simple. It's really, and deeply difficult at the same time. And it's really just a sense of, we live in a culture and in a consciousness which is overemphasized and atomized the individual. And I think he saw the praxis or orientation for somebody who's trying to live an integral life as both overcoming their own sense of self-separation and estrangement, and therefore, in a sense, overcoming their ego. Like the ego has become way too overemphasized. We've become way too hypertrophied, right? We want to gain a sense of transparency of the ego, which means, it might mean, you know, Wilber talks about shadow work. It might mean that there's a way in which Gebser talks about it. He says there's a German phrase, what we shout in the forest is what we hear back. So there's this sense in which the world and us are in this, always an echo, always a feedback, right? So there's always a sense in which we want to take back the projections from ourselves, to really kind of get over ourselves and really be in communion with the world and be in the spiritual present. But, you know, there's some beautiful passages when he writes that this is not just something an individual can do, right? It's, if you live in the world in this way, if you reclaim time, if you reclaim slowing down and mythical rhythmicity and really concretize that in your life, and magical attunement, and really concretize those aspects in your own life, the way in which you're going to live, right, the intensity in which you live the new, will automatically see the falseness of the present world, in the sense of, you know, all of the conditions we're dealing with right now, social alienation, an empty form of time, an empty form of living. There's a German philosopher called Byung-Chul Han, who wrote a great book called The Scent of Time. And towards the end of the book is a very Gebserian moment to make my point about daily living. He says there's a difference between via activa and via contemplativa, and that our culture has so emphasized activity. It's not only desouling, right? It's ultimately, it destroys the ego that has produced that world, so that we lose our sense of soul and we lose our sense of wholeness. So to live differently is to employ a different sense of time, a different way of being present, and to act in accordance with the whole. And that's a massive challenge. Of course, nobody alone can simply decide to do that and fix the world. But if there's enough of us living with that intensity, I do think that would make a difference. And again, part of this, one of the keys that I think Gebser offers, is a very careful and very thorough exploration of what it would mean to have these different structures of consciousness alive in us, right? And therefore to have a different relationship with time and being present in the world, having a different sense of self and a relationship with the whole. And to live with that intensity in our culture is to be kind of dangerous. I mean, it is to be kind of, I'm not going to be for, the machinations of a forward-directed society. I'm going to be present, and I'm going to be present with such an intensity that it might even be uncomfortable, because it will render transparent not only myself, but the emptiness of our cultural practices today. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but there's a kind of a intensity that he's offering that I think is definitely worth investigating. Great. So yeah, any questions, reflections?
May I?
Hey, Walter. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Walter Dreher, and just listening to this session now, some picture came up into myself when Cordula asked for the diaphanity. I am a long time struggling with Jean Gebser, and just let me use the following picture. You know, the person who is digging for coal in a coal mine, and he has some lamp on his head, and he's always looking in this direction where this light is falling. For me, it is similar to our mental rational way of thinking and living in the world. We are just always illuminating this small ray of this lamp, and in the night. And when the day comes up and the sun is lighting the world and it becomes all bright, I also am looking to this world, to the trees, the houses, to my life, to the garden, as if it is a widened ray of myself, of my mental way of looking to the things. And now I somehow learned from Jean Gebser, but somehow beyond the mental rational way of thinking is a kind of integral way of bringing things together into my consciousness. But this is illuminated by another light, a light beyond the mental rational way of thinking I know until now. And I don't know clearly how to deal with this. It has to do something with the evolution maybe of our consciousness and the involution of some light which asks myself, please realize this new consciousness. It's your turn to change. So in this kind of dynamic, I am very much stuck in. Of course, I got some responses from you, Jeremy, in your last class, but still, I am struggling strongly. And I think, Daniela, before I don't touch this new quality, it's very hard to discover in daily life what integral thinking or living or looking through, yeah, can be. Sorry, a little bit long explanation, but I came up to this. This came up to me.
Oh, thank you, Walter. That's a great inquiry. I think we all struggle with that. But part of what comes to mind for me is the sense in which Gebser is always talking about, one of the prerequisites for this integral consciousness as again, that flexibility and plasticity of our ability to reintegrate, to concretize the earlier structures. Because part of what you're saying is like, how do we, it's almost the incomprehensibility of another structure. It's like, it's so totalizing, like what else other than the mental, what other kind of light could there be and not in the abstract, but how do I live that, right? For Gebser, I think part of the first step is just really defixating on the mental and concretizing the magic and the mythic again, and cultivating that sense of equanimity that I talk about, or he talks about detachment. There's almost a sense of grace in that, in the ability to, once we do that, once we are becoming a little bit more flexible and working on the magic and the mythic in our lives and paying attention to that in daily living, moving back into the mental, as we will do, because that's, you know, the kind of center of gravity of our of this now collapsing world, but also it's still, you know, where our predominant attitude is. That movement is going to create a space. It's going to, that interrelationship between the structures is what's important. There's a space between that. I think those gaps, those moments where we move back and forth, that something can come forward, that kind of clarity that Gebser talks about comes forward. It's a sense of the whole that can only really be appreciated when we are living dynamically. And that's the difficult thing, but it's also like, it's helpful, because that alone is a tremendous task, to defixate on the mental. So that might be a good place to start, just in terms of, well, you know, how vivid is my mythical life, just in terms of working with the images of the psyche, employing or becoming familiar with time as quality, time as intensity and rhythmicity in our daily living. How much do we really relate to that and aren't completely succumbed by mental direct time? This is something that we all wrestle with in a very concrete day-to-day way, quite literally day-to-day. So there's so many opportunities to explore these earlier structures. And as I was just saying, I think it's that space between the structures as we begin to work with them in a very concrete, embodied sense, where the integral can kind of irradiate, you know. There's a beautiful passage that maybe Cordula, we were mentioning earlier about Gebser went at Sarnath, and he even described the integral in that moment, in that kind of epiphany. I would say that was the epiphany of the spiritual for him at Sarnath, when he was describing it as a transparent light, not a wakeful light, not a daylight, but this transparent light which irradiated everything. And he described it as recasting him. He's been recast or remolded ever since. So but that's not something, you know, he reached up and grabbed heroically with his ego, or you know, there was a sense in which, a beautiful sense in which it sort of happened, just walking to a particular place and being present for it, and discovering it in himself. So I think there's a sense of grace that we have to afford too, in terms of the integral, holding that, and then also knowing, like, our own activity of living integrally, it must be, as a prerequisite, this flexibility and plasticity of consciousness, just allowing that to be the playground for this to be. All right, I'm going to use one more metaphor from contemplative practices. Shinzen Young talks about this, about being kind of prone to enlightenment. You can really only put yourself in the conditions to be prone for that to presentiate. So I don't know if that helps at all, but thank you. Very good question. I think it's something we all wrestle with. Yes, Brigitte. Let's see. Let me ask to unmute. There we go.
Yeah, hi, I'm not Brigitte. That's my girlfriend. It's
okay.
My name is Joseph.
Hi, Joseph.
Well, I'm a little bit, although maybe in that direction, like Mr. Dreher. For me, there's a personal kind of evolution. That it's like becoming more and more, and there's something which is actually decreasing, becoming less and less and less. And these are like two different kinds of being, which belong together, of course, but which are completely different also. And what I miss a little bit from Gebser, that he doesn't really address this side of decreasing or disappearing into nothingness. I've read it again, and at one point he said, spirituality we leave to the priests. So maybe it's long, I didn't understand it well, but somehow I understand that he tries to get somewhere beyond rational, which you never can get with a rational. You only can, like you said, you only can maybe make you prone for some grace to come. But then there's something which is far more than all that we have, or I have experienced before. And it's sometimes it's just, I don't have the words even to explain it. And this kind of, how to say, experience, I just don't find in Gebser's words, or maybe I'm not very much familiar to it, but maybe you could tell me what he's thinking about this decreasing into nothingness. Actually, that is meditating into, yeah, until you disappear. I think that's a sense of meditation. And on the other hand, you develop and explain that what you experience in the words of the structure you are at. That's actually Wilber's integral, as I understand. And I just don't get the connection between Wilber's theory, integral theory, and Gebser's. It's like there's something missing for me. But I don't know
if I can,
right.
If I could explore that with you, you know, Gebser talks about the spiritual. Towards the end of Ever-Present Origin, he has some interesting language about this, where he's saying, you know, there's a kind of evolution of religion we can look at from religio and religion, like the binding back to preligio, which he says is an obligation to the present, right? To no longer be bound to the past, to bind back, but to be bound to the present in some way. I think of a spirituality in that context, but in terms of how he understood ego freedom, he talks about, you know, okay, the integral structure of consciousness, he has criteria for it. Arational, as you mentioned, the arational he talks about, the aperspectival, you know, the freedom from space, the freedom from time. But in the individual, he says it's freedom from ego. There's an ego freedom that's achieved. So for me, it has a little bit more to do with an understanding. I don't like to go into the language non-dual, but at the same time, there seems to be a way in which the world and its achievements and its actualizations are still there, but they've also become fundamentally transparent to origin and in a way emptied out. He calls it there's some subtle language he uses talking about this emptiness, or is not a void but a plenum. And again, I will go back to that opening line from about Malaga, Spain, the vibrating, shimmering sky of Spain, the clear blue sky. So I think to describe what he's talking about, I think those are good metaphors to talk about the openness of the sky. I know Dzogchen talks quite a bit about this. I've been drawn to Zen Buddhism and Dogen's writing, particularly about the relationship between emptiness and form, to try to talk about what Gebser's saying, because yes, there is this concretization in history and matter and creative realizations of things, and ever-present origin is irradiating through that, is presentiating through that, and it is empty, it is open. So there's a way in which things are opaque and open at the same time and clear, and it's difficult to put into language, as you're saying. But I don't quite get the point about what you mentioned about Wilber and Gebser in that sense, because for Gebser, it's not a going back. It's not a removing of the self. The self could stay. The self is just transparent to the originary intensity, the intensity of origin in which it is participating in and being brought into being through. So there is a fundamental emptiness in there, and yet there's also a form. So which is why I'm kind of going into the non-dual emptiness and form. But I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but this is how he sees it. He doesn't necessarily see the realm of becoming and development and history as separate from the realm of origin, or, you know, before the beginning, going back to that. There's no need to go back. It's ever present. There's a way to see through the phenomenal world. Yeah, let me know if I'm getting warmer there at all, because I'm not sure.
Well, I think it's something like I thought. I guess for me, it's not about disappearing. For me, it's just letting go of identification with my ego. Then everything is here, me too, but I'm not exclusively identified with it. That's for me where it's going to. And so everything is possible. Also here, time becomes a different quality, because time, if you can see that everything which you think or imagine in the future or think from the past, you just think and imagine right now. So it's time becomes a completely different quality. And maybe that's what Gebser meant with perspectiveness. Or maybe it comes here together, but yeah.
The time thing is interesting. Just to mention briefly, that again, I'll go to Dogen's writing actually about this. There's a couple of books about his text called Uji, UJI, and a few books writing about it by Dainin Katagiri Roshi, and then one of Katagiri Roshi's students, where I think Dogen's actually a good, he's equally enigmatic as Gebser, let me just say that. But the writing about Dogen and his book Time Being is really good, because it's sort of going like, okay, we always say non-duality, oneness with reality, enlightenment, great, but we don't really think about temporics involved in that non-duality, that wholeness. So the writing itself is a very interesting exercise in stretching our sense of time and space, as sort of both needing to be looked at in terms of an enlightenment of time, or a wholeness of time. So I would actually recommend looking at that a little bit. But yeah, I think the key, as you're saying, the key to understanding Gebser and integral consciousness is really having a fluent relationship with temporics, really coming to understand these different expressions of temporics, because Gebser's able to work with both these contemplative traditions that talk about this sort of, you know, before the beginning origin. He's also able to work with history and process, and he's also able to work with this sort of, okay, well, what happens in the transpersonal, you know? So he's really working with these themes in a different way than I think Wilber is in that context. But yeah, really good question. It would be fun to unpack that for a whole session. Each one of our questions can be entire sessions.
I actually think, sadly, we can just take one more question if we look at the time. I'm really taken by that fluidity that you bring in here, that sense of being moved by so many different dimensions, and that plasticity. What really stays with me is that word how do you say? Plasticity?
Plasticity, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, that's definitely something that's coming even in my body this evening. So we have a couple of minutes, and is someone having a really burning? Harald?
Yeah, if possible. Maybe it leads a bit far away, but I was just thinking, we are all meditators, and we know that we can throw a lot of perspectives into the world, and even to ourselves. But at the same time, we have really a crisis, and thank you a lot how you described the crisis at the beginning of this session. And what I found really interesting that the stages of consciousness you described more as a bowl than like a teleological thing. But we live in a presence of crisis, And that means there's also a lot of suffering in this world right now. And we can develop a lot of empathy to all this suffering. Maybe we can act in somewhere, but it's really too hard to bear for one of us. At the same time, we have a kind of neoliberalism. And thank you for mentioning Byung-Chul Han, who said something about, I don't know the English word for in Müdigkeitsgesellschaft, and how he's talking about self-perfection or self-optimization, all that. And with all these perspectives, maybe that's a little bit chaotic what I'm saying right now, but these are very different perspectives at the moment we try to integrate. And I really have a little bit of problem how to bring that all together in real life. In my thoughts, it's very easy, but to bring together in real life these whole dimensions, political, social, stages of development, suffering, crisis, fugitives, and all that we have in the world. Could you say something about that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just a little thing, right?
I know that's a lot, but sorry.
No, good. It's a good question. Maybe a good one to end on. Like, okay, what do we do? I want to mention. Maybe I could just read a line from Gebser from the English translation when he's talking in the daily life section. I highly recommend if you have a copy of this book to read. It's towards the end. I think it's chapter 10. Towards the end of the book, daily life section 2, and he says, okay. So it's only as a whole man is man in a position to perceive the whole, but does not our life in the factory and office, the senselessness of our labors today, automation, mechanization, and technologization stand in the way? On the contrary, all the more clearly, if we live integrally, right, if we take this up as a practice for ourselves, all the more clearly will the false form of time's eruption be evident as expressed in motoricity and the scramble for worthless goods and the like, which must be overcome. He says it right there. This is a sociological question that it must be overcome. Our mechanized, industrial-oriented life. It's a lifestyle. It's a cultural practice. These are economic and social practices that are part of this crisis, and they must be overcome, and they're intimate with this. And this is why I bring up Byung-Chul Han, because Byung-Chul Han's entire point at the end of his book, is the end of that thesis, is we need via contemplativa. We can't be all about marching forward through via activa and making things and producing and marching forward. So our entire cultural way of life is what is undergoing this crisis right now with the climate change and everything else. So, yeah, and he says such an environment will change to the extent that we are able to realize our task. And for this, everyone has the requisite leisure. I don't know if that's true, and sense of obligation. But he's saying this is something we can participate in daily life. But that also means, I think, a sense of transparency that this is not, and this is part of the problem, as you mentioned. I think you said neoliberalism. This is part of the issue in that deep perspectival atomization that I can work on myself and fix the world. There's an abyss between the self and the world right now that needs to be healed and remediated. And so I think part of the practice for integralists right now is to find the bridges in that gap between, okay, I can live a nice contemplative, meditative life and practice and look at the structures of consciousness in myself. But unless we have an appropriate container bridging into the social and realizing, okay, well, what needs to be remediated? Maybe having a practice can help clarify that. But I think it also requires integralists as scholars, activists, poets, artists, movie makers, whatever, to be able to articulate what that looks like and to create new culture. So I think there's an injunction here that is not just individual, it's also the creation of a new culture. And then also for scholars to identify what that is, like Gebser was doing. Okay, where is it popping up in economics? Where is it showing up in architecture? Where is it showing up in social practices? And that's part of what I'd like to do in my own next book, but also as a community, I think it's really important for integralists to be pointing out, hey, this is an integral-oriented impulse right now in culture. I'll give you concrete examples. The peer-to-peer network with like Michel Bowens and what he's doing with Peer-to-Peer Foundation, commons and common studies, the whole field of the non-human world and the post-human turn. Bayo Akamalafe is a good example. These are people really working on these psycho-spiritual cultural directions, and then also tangible material transformations of our world. Okay, can a new economic system be more integral in its temporics? Can there be new social practices that are superseding neoliberalism, both economically and socially? How do we propagate those in the world, right? Those things, I don't think integralists alone are creating them. I think they're a rising of itself because this is a new structure of consciousness that is taking hold in us and we're participating in it. But as integralists, I think our gift is to be able to be aware of that as it's happening and really kind of build those bridges and point out where we can participate and engage beyond ourselves. Because if we don't, then we're still in some way really trapped in that perspectival crisis, that atomization crisis that we're dealing with. So great question. Really great question. Thank you.
And I think this was a perfect ending quote, something we can all go home and do. This endless list of where to start and where to end. So that's wonderful. It's very motivating to go further with that. I just, apart from thanking you really very much, Jeremy, for being with us tonight, and everyone else, of course. It's going to be our pleasure to deepen these talks and to do some literature studying and explore. So if you're interested, Christoph, I think you did put the link in the chat window where you can find us if you want to enroll in the 6-evening course. I think it's every 3 or 4 weeks that we meet in Zoom in the classes. It's a co-organization with the Integral Forum. And also at this point, I need to really thank the Gebser Gesellschaft Bern. I don't know if people are here from there who have been working with us very beautifully, and the January magazine of the Integral Perspectives has been a beautiful collaboration with the Gebser friends in Bern. And if you're interested in interviews, people who knew Gebser, his wife, how he lived, what he did, in this online magazine from January, you can find a lot of things from the archive and from friends from Gebser who knew him still personally. So I really hope you enjoy reading that. And then also, of course, we have the salons. We have quite a lot of salon people here from the Integral Forum. And it was our idea that if you like to explore on these topics further, have a look on the link to our salons. Maybe you find one close by, maybe you find one online. Just address the salon leads if they're interested in having maybe a post talk, maybe the one or other topic that we touched tonight wants to be in depth or communicated further. And Laura and Christoph, and I see Heidi is here, and Verena is here. There's quite a lot of people who maybe, if you're interested, are open to have a salon evening on Gebser or on literature of Gebser, or just questions that popped up tonight. So I think I didn't forget anything. Christoph helped me. Thank you, Christoph, also for helping us technically with everything tonight. Did I mention everything that we needed to say?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
Oh, yes, but I must excuse also Michael Höger, who was going to be a co-host, but he's sick, unfortunately, and couldn't be here. As far as I see, he didn't make it. But he's a very dear friend to us, the Integral Forum, and also to Jeremy for the work he's doing in the Gebser Society in Bern. So we greet him. We're going to send him the Aufzeichnung and hope he's going to enjoy it. So much love from me, and hope you all enjoyed the evening, and many thanks for your participation. Thank you, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Cordula. Thank you, everybody. It's been fantastic. If you have any questions about my course, please, I left my email in the notes here in the chat. So feel free to follow up if you do have any technical questions. And yeah, looking forward to seeing some of you there. And thank you again.
Bye. See you soon.